Paul Afshar is an up-and-coming podcaster whose podcast My Mum Made Me is about the wonderful and sometimes weird ways our mums make us who we are today. And Paul is on the line with us here. How are you today?
I'm great, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. So what gave you the idea to create this podcast?
Well, much like I think quite a lot of other people, around the world, had you might call an eccentric childhood and an eccentric mum.
Yeah.
So, just to give you an example, my mum is a devout Catholic, and she took us to church 5 times a week. But on the other hand, would sort of steal prayer books and rewrite the prayers so they were gender neutral. So they wouldn't make reference to our Father or the Lord. It would be very sort of neutral language. So, all of those influences, I think, bore quite heavy on me as a kid, and as an adult have become such a sort of deep part of my own identity. And I really wanted to explore that with other people, particularly people, in the public eye, people who are sort of athletes, actors, activists. I just thought it was a really interesting topic.
And what have you found from some of your guests? Have they had quite similar experiences growing up, or does it vary?
Well, I think everyone has, a set of stories about their own mom, and indeed their own parents, that are sort of eccentric or weird or kind of out of the blue. But I think what I found is that, and maybe this is a bit of selection bias with people who come on the podcast, but there is such like a really kind of embryonic, really close relationship between the people I speak with and their mums, sometimes in a really great way, sometimes in a not so great way. So to give you an example of the former, one of my guests, Kirsty, who she runs a big charity called Save the Children, her mum Morag, ran away when she was 13 after her parents died, and searched out her brothers back in Scotland, was sort of living in a squat effectively when they were kids, and that was her experience growing up. And as an adult, she got really into fighting for children's rights in Scotland, and protecting kids around the world, and that clearly has had such a big influence on Kirsty and shaped the woman that she's become, both in terms of what she's chosen to do, Save the Children, but also her moral compass as well. And it's really sort of not to get too much into the psychology of it, but I think it's really interesting to see the sort of the footprints of our mums in us. In a way, they kind of break the ice. They're the vanguard. They're sort of guiding the way. Not always in a way that we always realise until perhaps we're a little bit later in life.
Yeah, that's for sure. How important do you think our mums are in shaping us? I mean, do you think they have such a big impact that we don't actually realise they've shaped who we are?
Oh, hugely so. And I can give you an example of my own experience. My my mum raised us in the north of England in the sort of late 80s, basically. And she's white. She's Irish Catholic by heritage. My dad is Muslim and brown. And so, we had mixed heritage. And she was always very kind of conscious of racism and identity growing up in, a place like that. But I remember really clearly when this girl in the street called my sister a P word. I'm sure your listeners can put two together and work out what that is. But my mum, in her kind of own way, just sort of grabbed the girl by her scarf of her coat. She said, "If you don't take that back, I'm going to kick you with my size 8 DM boots." And that was for her, just a real kind of push back in the face and a real fighting for us and our identity. And back to your question, how's that impacted me? Well, I think, obviously that experience looms large in my memory, but the way she dealt with it, the way that she wouldn't let it go, and she stood up for, in this case, my sister, but, someone who was under attack, I think has definitely shaped who I am. I'm definitely, the one to back the underdog or kind of defend someone if they are under attack. And I hadn't realised that until perhaps a couple of years ago when I started telling these stories to people.
Yeah. And in terms of the podcast, what kind of guests do you like to have on? Is there a type, or does it not really matter as long as they have a mum.
Yeah, I think, look, as long as they have a mum. But what I will say is, all of the guests I have on have a pretty unique story to tell. Whether it's Kirsty, the woman I mentioned before, or Eamon, whose mum, she used to keep a kind of record of every day that they were kids in a little book, and when she died, they kind of found it in her attic. They've all got these wonderful memories and a kind of very unique relationships with their mums. Some of them are in the public eye, some of them are just regular folk like you and I, but they're united by a unique perspective on how their own mum has borne on them as an adult.
Yeah. Do you discuss with the guest before recording to make sure that they've actually got some interesting stories, or do you like to perhaps surprise yourself?
A bit of both, if I'm honest. I mean, like I said at the beginning, I think, when people are asked to think about it, there's always a set of experiences that you remember. You go, hold on a second, was that normal, or was that sort of conventional, or was that something that I remember for good or bad reasons? Everyone has that, and so sometimes it's really fun to go into those conversations, as you say, just exploring and unpacking that, sometimes for the first time with people. And I think that's what's interesting from a kind of listener perspective, in that there's no sort of real formula or structure for how we do that. It's very much at their pace, and a lot of people who've listened to the podcast already, and we've had a great response so far, have said, you know what, you really got me thinking about my own relationship with my mum and how it's impacted me and the memories I have of her, whether they're still with us or not. So it's lovely to have that impact through the very sort of original and sometimes quite raw conversations we end up having with the guests.
Yeah, and I suppose it is interesting about the weird things that our mums or dads or whatever parents can do sometimes that we don't realise until we're older aren't normal, and sometimes it does take quite a lot of thinking to sort of think of things that they did that aren't normal, because we're so used to them that we maybe think they were normal.
Exactly. And just to give you another example from my own childhood, again, it's to do with my mum being a Catholic, or rather, religious, but she raised us vegan as well. And in her mind, the way she reconciled these two things was in the following way. So we went to church every Sunday. I went to a religious school, and it came time for me to make my first Holy Communion, which is when you get to, be, confirmed effectively and sort of take the bread and the wine at church on a Sunday. And I was really excited, and I rushed home and I told my mum. She said, no, you can't. And the reason for her saying no was because we were vegan. And in her mind, she really did believe that the wine and the bread actually transformed into the body and blood of Christ. Wow. And if we took it, technically we'd be committing a form of weird kind of like religious cannibalism. So, I mean, that, I have to say, is a very warped but strangely sort of logical way to reconcile both of those beliefs. But again, it's one of those things that I think, God, how on earth did she manage to do that? And how has it impacted me as an adult?
That's an interesting thought. I've never thought of that. I wonder what the correct answer is to that.
Well, we'll have to ask a priest, I'm sure.
Yeah. And you seem to have quite a chemistry with your guests, don't you? I mean, are these people that you know already, or are you just quite natural at talking to people?
Oh, well, I'm not sure about that. I do love, I mean, I'm enjoying this conversation. I do love sort of chatting to people about, that it doesn't have to be about their mum, but their own sort of sense of memory and experiences. Some of the guests I know, or sort of their friends of friends, I'd say probably half are so far, because we just started out, and half are people that I, have read about and kind of pitched the idea to, and they've been interested. The difference, I think, is when you know a little bit about someone's relationship with their parent, in this case their mum, that's quite interesting to sort of, as I say, unpack with them. And when you don't, there's quite an interesting kind of almost roller coaster of a journey to go on with them, about their own kind of memories and childhood experiences. So look, I mean, mean, I'd love to kind of, get really interesting stories from, I don't know, people who've suffered hardship, people who, I do think about some of the relationships that, I don't know, people who are fleeing war in Ukraine, whose mums or parents are perhaps still stuck back in the Ukraine, the relationship that, how that bears down on a relationship with your parent then. So I think there's so much, bandwidth and kind of space to explore in that relationship. It's not just the kind of the funny, witty, weird stories. It can be the really deep and meaningful as well.
Yeah. Well, what future episodes have you got coming up? Are there ones that you have recorded or about to record?
Absolutely. So we have a wonderful pop star called Neo 10Y, whose mum fled Uganda under the regime of Idi Amin, and came to the UK as a sort of young girl. Now he is this sort of queer pop star who's on a mission to make the world vegan. And it's really interesting to kind of explore like how both of them are very different but kind of very similar. We've also got a wonderful actor coming up called George Webster. So he was in the award-winning TV series Versailles. He played William of Orange, and we're going to be sort of talking about his own mom and parents' influence on his career. So there's lots of kind of interesting, unique characters coming up on the podcast, which I think people will find quite interesting.
Yeah, it sounds exciting. Well, where can we find the podcast? Is it in all the usual places?
It's in all the usual places, and you can go to mymummademe.com, which I've just set up literally yesterday, to listen to it as well.
Excellent. Well, many thanks for coming on today. It's been great to talk to you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much.